After moving down from Newcastle to Gloucestershire, I grew up in a lovely Cotswold village that had a few farms and very picturesque scenery. The milk that was delivered to us in the morning, in glass bottles, came from the cows that lived behind our back fence. Harvest was a special time. It involved singing those old favourite hymns, a bread sculpture of some kind, piles of fresh produce from the local allotments, and always my mum frantically trying to find anything in the cupboard that we could bring to church 5 minutes before the service was due to start. In school we would talk about how lovely autumn is and how we should be thankful and share with others. This is what I think of if somebody says the word harvest to me. Harvest appeals to me as part of the recognition of the seasonality of the planet that we live on and of our faith too. But I must admit that part of what I like is the nostalgia. It's not wrong for us to want to replay these rituals. Ritual is important. Many people would feel heartbroken at not having the opportunity to sing "We plough the fields and scatter," despite never having ploughed or scattered anything in their lives. Harvest speaks to me of our rootedness in creation, our utter dependence on earth, and its fruits that God has given us. However, our weekend at Shepherd's Dean confirmed to me that many of us are discerning that our appreciation of the earth is now an important and urgent issue. And along with our familiar rituals, we need to push ourselves with new actions and commitments. Both inside and outside of the church, Harvest is providing an opportunity for us to consider the future of our environment, and this future may look radically different to our treasured memories of the past. At our parish weekend at Shepherd's Dean, we reflected on our calling as Christians to be stewards of the earth. I was encouraged by the passion of our discussions. This seemed to be something that members of this congregation care about deeply. In our reflections, we concluded that appreciation for our planet is not enough. Our care must be shown in our actions towards our beautiful world. You may have seen in the news that across the world this week there's been lots of demonstrations focusing on the environment. I've been incredibly moved at the pictures posted by Christian Climate Action on Facebook. They've been using public worship as a form of demonstration, including a Eucharist and baptisms at the centre of the protest. I've printed out each of you a post. There's a few different ones, so if you want to have a look at each other just for a second. So there's pictures of, there's the public baptism, there's the Eucharist in the centre of the protest, there's people praying, there's bishops and clergy reading from the Bible as part of the protest. I found these incredibly moving. It's not just the fact that they're demonstrating because they're Christians, it's that very thing of worshipping in a public space to draw attention to the issue that I found very powerful. This form of public prophetic action may or may not be what each of us are individually called to. Not all of us are privileged enough to be able to give up a day or two's work to protest, or be in a position that being arrested would have very few consequences. However, the responsibility of the church as a whole to speak out on such matters is in no doubt. As part of the Anglican Communion, we are committed to the 5 marks of mission. The fifth is to strive to safeguard the integrity of creation and sustain and renew the life of the earth. To see Christians in handcuffs for taking this call seriously really took my breath away. It seemed a million miles away from the cosy harvest festivals that I grew up with, but they are both expressions of thankfulness for our world. This idea of important ritual meeting radical thankfulness is seen in today's gospel. We have the account of Jesus healing 10 people affected by leprosy or other skin diseases. They are anxious about approaching Jesus. I assumed that this would be a measure to contain the spread of disease. But actually I was surprised to learn that leprosy is not easily transmitted from person to person. A tiny proportion of people who come into contact with the bacteria will actually contract the disease. And then it can take up to 20 years before symptoms begin to show. A major factor in the spread of the disease is living in extreme poverty. If you can forgive the use of modern terms to describe an ancient mindset, it seems that their exclusion was much more due to social stigma and religious law than hygiene. The fact that the disease was found amongst the poorest made it easier for communities to turn their backs on those who were affected. When they call out to Jesus, he sends them on their way to the priests. And as they go, they find that they've been healed. They are sent to the priests because ritual dictated that a priest would confirm their recovery and allow their re-entry into society and religious life. Going to the priest is not only the normal course of action, it is what Jesus tells them to do, and off they go. Apart from one. He returns to Jesus, giving thanks and praise to God. He recognises that only God could heal him and falls at his feet in gratitude. This man, a Samaritan, stops in his tracks and turns back to Jesus. Jesus' response, I find a little confrontational. He says, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? Has not one returned to give praise to God except this foreigner?" He then said to them, "Rise and go. Your faith has made you well." Part of me wants to say, come on, Jesus, they're doing exactly what you just told them to do. Be fair. But actually, those times when Jesus acts in a way that we don't expect or even find a bit rude can teach us a lot. Jesus still sends the cured man to the priests, but first he expects that their encounter with him will also provoke a response from their own hearts. Some of the old ways are important, but when Jesus shakes things up, it is up to us to discern what new and fresh things the Spirit is moving us towards. For many of us today, that traditional seasonality of the church's year is life-giving, but we should seek to complement familiarity with actions that turn us back to God in unexpected ways. I'd like to explore a few ways in which we can be rooted in our sense of harvest ritual, but radical in our response to it. At harvest, we tend to naturally focus on thankfulness and for the abundance that God has given us and the beauty of the earth. Let's keep the man that turned back to Jesus in mind, because turning back to the source of our blessing is really important. How do we live thankfully? Let's not pretend that this is an easy one. Life does not always take a path that we are thankful for. Each of us will have known desperation, perhaps lack of food, safety, health, or love. In those situations, being told, "be grateful," really hurts. I believe thankful living is less about being satisfied with what we have, though for many of us in the West this is a large part of it, and more about acknowledging our reliance on God. Gratitude is diminished by our sense of entitlement. I've earned this, it's mine. If our perspective shifts to, I've been given this, it's God's, perhaps our perspective will become more thankful. Those who have little seem to have a greater sense of God's blessing. The man who was healed would still have been living in extreme poverty, with nowhere to live and incredibly vulnerable. But he recognises Jesus as the only source of blessing in his life. The more we have, the easier it is for us to deceive ourselves that we are responsible. If I say to myself, I've worked hard, or I made good decisions, then God's guiding presence in my life will go unnoticed. Living thankfully acknowledges God as the source of blessing and encourages us to turn back to God both in times of need and times of plenty. Whether in a rural place like where I grew up, or here in Byker, collecting food for harvest is an important ritual. Local projects like the People's Kitchen and the Food Bank rely heavily on harvest donations, and the visual display of gifts in church is a reminder that Jesus charged us with feeding those who are hungry. We are living in fragile times, and it is easy to see that people find themselves in real need. And I know lots of us really want to help. When faced with the scale of this problem, you might wonder how we can move from rifling the cupboards for a tin of pineapple chunks to challenging a system that traps so many people in poverty in the first place. It is clear that we cannot do such a task on our own. Our giving of harvest gifts is hugely important and provides comfort and relief to those in desperate need. As we do this, though, with the healed man in our minds, it is clear that we must also turn back to Jesus. Well-stocked food banks are an outworking of faith, but we shouldn't give up on the idea that through turning back to Jesus in prayer and action, we may affect change so that we can live in a country where food banks are not needed at all. I'd like to bring us back to our photos from the beginning. I want to ask one final question for our radical harvest. How do we share the fruits of the earth, not just with our neighbours, but with our descendants too? Previously at harvest time, I've always reflected on the inequality of today. It is easy to see as we look around the gulf between those who have the most and those who have the least. And I think in Tyne we do a wonderful job of being attentive to that in our local area and working together to try to meet those needs. I think when it comes to climate justice, for those who will come after us, I think the threat seems less obvious and immediate. How do we ensure that those in the future are not hungry because of failed harvests or the economic consequences of climate change? With the healed man in our mind, we do not just carry on with what everyone else is doing. We turn back to God, our Creator. As Helen said at Shepherd's Dean, we can support each other individually and as a church to think more about stewardship of God's creation, and over the next few months reflect on our care for the earth. As part of thankful living, we can joyfully remind ourselves that we are living in God's beautiful creation and it is to be shared, not just with our neighbours, but with future generations of God's children. At harvest time, we give thanks for the beauty of creation, the abundance of God's gifts, and our responsibility to live thankfully and share resources. As we do this, rooted in our tradition, we must follow the example of the healed Samaritan man and take the radical action to turn back to God. Because our faith demands that with Jesus in our lives, there can be no business as usual. Amen.